A billionaire walks into a small neighborhood grocery store with one goal: destroy it quietly, legally, and completely. The owner is a calm black woman who has refused every offer he has sent, no matter how absurd the number. So he decides to test her, switching into a dialect so rare that barely 60 families on Earth still speak it, certain she won't understand a single word. She does, and what she knows could bring his entire empire to its knees. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. Salvatore De Luca did not look like trouble when he walked through the door. That was the thing about men like him. They had learned, over decades of boardrooms and quiet takeovers, how to make themselves look like something other than what they were. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people in this neighborhood, made in 3 months. No tia, just the top button undone, as though he wanted to seem relaxed. But everything about the way he moved, measured, deliberate, each step placed like a chess piece, told a different story. He stepped into Brooks' Specialty Grocery on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the air outside had just started to carry that first serious bite of cold. The shop sat on the corner of Alderton Street and 4th, wedged between a dry cleaner and a pharmacy that had been there since before anyone could remember. From the outside, it looked like nothing remarkable. A hand-painted wooden sign above the door, a small chalkboard near the window listing the week's specials in careful handwriting, and a string of small lights someone had wound around the door frame that glowed warm yellow even in daylight. Inside, it smelled like cardamom and dried oranges and something Salvatore could not immediately name, a sweetness that sat underneath everything else, familiar in a way that caught him off guard. The shelves were deep and crowded without being cluttered. Imported olive oils stood in rows beside hand-labeled jars of preserved lemons. There were spices in small paper bags folded at the top with a staple, dried herbs bundled with twine, a glass case near the back holding wheels of aged cheese wrapped in cloth. Soft music played from somewhere. Something instrumental, Mediterranean, maybe the kind of thing you heard in old restaurants where people still ate slowly. 2 customers were already inside. An older woman with silver hair and a canvas bag was examining a row of Jared goods near the window with the focused attention of someone who had opinions about olive brines. A younger man in a postal uniform was waiting near the register, chatting with the woman behind the counter about whether the shop carried a particular kind of dried fig. That woman was Amara Brooks. Salvatore had looked at a photograph of her before coming. A grainy image pulled from her business license, not particularly clear. In person, she was different from what he had expected, though if he had been honest with himself, he could not have said exactly what he had expected. She was calm in the way that certain people are calm, not because nothing was happening around them, but because they had decided, somewhere deep inside, that very little was worth disrupting their peace. She wore a dark green apron over a simple button-down shirt, her hair pulled back, moving behind the counter with the ease of someone entirely at home in the space she occupied. She was helping the postal worker, laughing at something he said, and then wrapping the figs carefully in a small paper bag without being asked. Salvatore stood near the entrance for a moment, taking stock of the room. He had chosen to come without an entourage today, just himself and his cousin Luca, who had followed him in and was now standing slightly behind and to the left, looking at a display of imported pastas with the practiced disinterest of a man who was actually paying very close attention to everything. The postal worker paid for his figs, tucked them into his shirt pocket, said goodbye to Amara by name, and left. The older woman near the window looked up briefly as the door closed. She caught Salvatore's eye, smiled politely the way strangers do when they're sharing a small space, and returned to her olive brines. Salvatore moved toward the counter. "Good morning." He said it pleasantly. He was always pleasant at first. Amara looked up and met his eyes without any particular reaction. "Morning. Can I help you find something?" "Just browsing for now." He glanced along the counter, letting his eyes move across the products as though genuinely curious. "Interesting shop. How long have you been here?" "Long enough," she said. She smiled as she said it. Not unfriendly, but not an invitation either. He tried again. "This neighborhood is changing fast. I imagine you've seen a lot of that. Every neighborhood changes." She straightened a small display of honey jars that didn't particularly need straightening. Some change because the people in them grow. Some change because someone from the outside decides they should. She said it calmly, pleasantly even, but there was a precision to it that told him she knew exactly who he was. Of course she knew. His acquisition team had sent 6 separate offers over the past 14 months. Formal letters on heavy company letterhead. 2 in-person visits from corporate liaisons who wore nice shoes and spoke carefully about market value and opportunity and the exciting future of this part of the city. Amara had turned them all down. The last offer, the one Salvatore had personally authorized, had been set at 10 times the assessed market value of the building and the land beneath it. It was, by any reasonable accounting, an extraordinary sum of money for a small corner grocery. She had declined that one too, in writing, politely. That was what had brought Salvatore here in person. Not just the refusal. He had encountered refusals before. It was the politeness of it, the absolute absence of hesitation. Most people, when confronted with that kind of number, at least paused. Even people who ultimately said no would take a few days, consult a lawyer, talk to family, come back with a counteroffer. It was human nature to at least consider it. Amara had responded within 48 hours with a brief, courteous letter that essentially said no thank you and nothing else. That was not the behavior of someone who needed money. And looking at this shop, beautiful in its way, but modest, Salvatore had a hard time believing she simply didn't need money. Something else was keeping her here. He moved slowly along the counter, asking questions as though he were genuinely curious about the products. How did she source the olive oils? Were the spices imported or local? Had she built the customer base from scratch? Amara answered each question without elaboration, patient and precise. She was not rude. She was not flustered. She gave him exactly as much as the question required, and nothing more. I understand you've received some inquiries, he said finally, letting the pleasantness drop just slightly, not into hostility, but into something more direct. About the property. I have, she said. And you've chosen not to pursue any of them. I have. That's your right, of course. He placed both hands on the counter. I'm curious, though, just personally. A building like this, there must be something that makes it worth keeping, even when the offers are substantial. Amara looked at him with that same steady quiet. Lots of things are worth keeping that money can't replace. Such as, she tilted her head slightly. Mr. DeLuca, she said, and the use of his name, unhurried, unapologetic, made it clear she had known who he was since the moment he walked in. I appreciate you coming in person. You genuinely do. But the answer is the same as it's been every time someone from your company has asked. This shop is not for sale. Not at any price. Luca shifted behind him. Salvatore heard the small movement without turning around. He tried a different approach, softer, almost conversational. He asked about the shop's history, about the building itself, about the previous owner. Amara's answers grew quieter without becoming evasive. She confirmed the shop had changed hands 15 years ago. She confirmed she had been running it since then. Beyond that, she offered nothing. Salvatore glanced back at Luca. A brief look, a whole conversation in 2 seconds. Luca gave the faintest nod. And then Salvatore did something he had used exactly twice before in business situations that required a different kind of pressure. He turned back toward his cousin and began to speak, not in English and not in standard Italian, and not in the smooth Sicilian most people might recognize. He spoke in a dialect so narrow, so specific to a single community of villages on a hillside in northeastern Sicily, that he had only ever heard it spoken by members of his own extended family and a handful of old men in a mountain town he had visited 3 times in his childhood. The words came easily to him. They lived in his mouth the way certain things do when you learn them young, before language becomes something you have to think about. He spoke quietly to Luca, as though the shopkeeper simply weren't there, as though she were part of the furniture, like the honey jars and the dried herbs and the soft music coming from somewhere in the back. He said, she's protecting something in this building. We need to find out what before we move forward with the legal approach. Luca responded in the same dialect. Should I bring in someone to look at the building's history? The deed registration was unusual. Salvatore said, yes, and I want everything on her, where she came from, who she knows, how she got this property. Something doesn't fit. He had used the dialect this way before, in rooms where he didn't want to be understood, with business partners who spoke it as a kind of private layer of conversation that no one else could follow. It had never failed him. Dialect like that wasn't something you picked up in a classroom. It wasn't something you learned from a textbook or a language app. It was something you absorbed over years, in kitchens and on front steps and at long Sunday tables, from people who had grown up in the shadow of a specific mountain in a specific village where the language had been shaped by centuries of isolation. He was saying something else, something about the acquisition timeline and what the legal team had prepared, when Amara did something that stopped the words in his throat. She didn't look up. She was scanning a jar of preserved lemons at the register, her hand moving with the easy routine of someone who had done it 10,000 times. But her voice came quietly, steadily, and unmistakably in the exact same dialect. She said, "If you're going to speak about someone in their own shop, you might consider whether they're actually listening." The silence that followed was total. Even the music seemed to fade, or maybe Salvatore's mind simply stopped registering it. He stood completely still, both hands still resting on the counter, aware in some distant way that Luca, behind him, had gone perfectly motionless too. Amara set the jar of preserved lemons down on the counter with a small, careful click. Then she looked up at him. Her expression had not changed dramatically. There was no triumph in it, no performance. Just that same steadiness she had carried through the entire conversation. Except now, there was something underneath it that Salvatore recognized, after a long moment, as patience. The patience of someone who had been waiting for a particular moment to arrive and was simply noting that it had. The older woman near the window, the one with the silver hair and the canvas bag, had looked up from her olive brinds. She was watching them now with the mild curiosity of someone who could tell that the atmosphere in the room had shifted without being entirely sure why. Salvatore straightened slowly. He had lived a long time among people who use silence as a weapon, and he understood the instinct to fill it, to rush in with words and regain control of the shape of a conversation. He did not do that. Instead, he let the silence sit for another few seconds, using it to collect himself before he spoke. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. He kept his voice even. He was proud of that, after the fact. He asked it in English. If she had responded in the dialect, some part of his mind might have found an explanation, coincidence, approximation, someone who had picked up fragments somewhere. But she had spoken it precisely. The vowels flattened in exactly the way they flattened in San Fratello. The consonants carried the particular quality that came from a place where the language had evolved in near-complete isolation from the rest of Sicily for several hundred years. It was not a language you could approximate. You either had it or you didn't. "Pardon," Amara said. She said it in English, her voice mild, as though she hadn't just done something that had cracked the floor of the room open. "The dialect," Salvatore said. "Where did you learn it?" She looked at him with that same measured quiet. "Sometimes people think they know everything about a stranger," she said, "and then they find out they know almost nothing." It was not an answer. He knew that. She knew he knew that. The non-answer was deliberate. It closed a door in a way that a flat refusal would not have, because a flat refusal invites argument, and a closed door just sits there. "That's not a response," he said. "No," she agreed pleasantly. "It isn't." He pressed again, leaning forward slightly, allowing a little more of his actual self to show through the pleasantness. "That dialect is not something you study. It is not something you learn from recordings or university courses. There is no textbook for it. The community that speaks it is extremely small. I need to know how you came to speak it." Amara folded her hands on the counter. She had the hands of someone who worked, nails kept short, a faint roughness at the knuckles, a small scar across the back of the left hand that caught the light when she moved. She looked at him with something that might have been, if he had to give it a name, a kind of careful sympathy. "Mr. DeLuca," she said, "if you'd like to buy something, I'm happy to help. If you're here to talk about the property again, my answer hasn't changed. But I'm not going to have a conversation about my personal history with you today." "That dialect," Salvatore said, and there was something in his voice now that he couldn't fully control, a tightness at the edge of it, "belongs to a specific community. a specific village. The pronunciation you used, the particular way you shaped certain sounds, is not general Sicilian, is not Southern Italian. It is something so specific that I have only ever heard it from people who were raised inside that community from childhood. He stopped himself before he said more. He was already saying more than he intended to. Amara held his gaze for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "If you'll excuse me, I have a few things to restock." She turned and moved toward the back of the shop with the same unhurried ease she had carried through everything, her footsteps quiet on the old wooden floor. The older woman near the window was still watching. She caught Salvatore's eye again, this time with less politeness and more assessment, and then turned back to her jars. Salvatore stood at the counter for another moment. Then he turned to Luca and, very quietly, in English this time, said, "We're leaving." They walked out into the cold morning, and Salvatore stood on the sidewalk outside the shop without speaking. Lucas stood beside him, hands in his coat pockets, saying nothing, because he had worked with Salvatore long enough to know when to wait. A city bus moved past. Someone walked by with a dog on a leash. The dry cleaner's door opened, and a woman came out carrying a plastic-wrapped suit. "Everything," Salvatore said finally, still looking at the corner where Alderton met forth. "I want everything. Property records, business filings, tax history, anything she's ever signed her name to. Who she is, where she came from, how she got that building." He glanced at Luca. "I want to know how a woman running a grocery store on this corner learned to speak a dialect that barely 60 families in the world still use." Luca nodded once. He had a particular talent for information, finding it, gathering it, assembling it into a shape that was useful. It was why Salvatore kept him close. "I'll start today." "Quietly," Salvatore said. "Nothing that touches the corporate side yet. This is personal first." He looked back at the shop window. From the outside, through the glass, he could see the soft glow of the interior, the honey jars and the strings of lights and the shelves of imported goods. Amara had reappeared behind the counter and was speaking to the silver-haired woman now, smiling at something the woman had said. She looked completely ordinary. That was the thing that unsettled him more than the dialect itself. Not the shock of hearing it, though that had been profound, but the absolute evenness she had maintained through everything. The shock had belonged entirely to him. She had not seemed surprised that he was surprised. She had seemed to expect it, which meant she had been ready for him. Luca was methodical. He was also extremely good at what he did, which was why within 48 hours he had assembled everything publicly available on Amara Brooks and spread it across Salvatore's desk in a thick folder with color-coded tabs. There was, to put it plainly, almost nothing unusual. Business license, issued 15 years ago. Clean. Tax filings, consistent and accurate across every year on record. No liens, no disputes, no judgments against the property. Health and safety inspections for the shop, all passed without issue. Her personal background, to the extent that public records revealed anything, was unremarkable. An address in the city for 17 years, the shop for 15 of those. Her credit history, obtained through channels Luca preferred not to name directly, showed no unusual activity. No large, unexplained deposits. No offshore accounts. Nothing that suggested she was anything other than what she appeared to be, a woman who ran a small specialty grocery store and did it well. "Nothing," Salvatore said, sitting across from the desk, looking at the folder. "Almost nothing," Lucas said. "One thing." He pulled a single page from near the back of the folder and placed it on top. It was a copy of the property deed for the shop building, the original transfer document from 15 years ago when Amara had taken ownership. The previous owner's name was listed. What was unusual was the circumstance of the transfer. The previous owner had died without a will, leaving the property in a kind of legal limbo. A succession of quiet legal proceedings had followed, and, at the end of them, the building had passed to Amara Brooks under circumstances the records described only as resolution of estate claim, which was the kind of language that usually meant someone had been able to prove a connection to the deceased without formal documentation to support it. The previous owner died unexpectedly, Lucas said. There were no listed relatives, no spouse, no children, nothing on record. The estate should have gone to the city. But it didn't, Salvatore said. But it didn't. Salvatore looked at the document for a long moment. Then he set it down and looked out the window of his office at the skyline of the city stretching in every direction, the ordered geometry of glass and steel and ambition that he had spent 30 years learning to navigate. The previous owner's name was not one he recognized. But the fact of the transfer, the fact that Amara had a legal claim to a building whose rightful heir no one could clearly identify, was exactly the kind of thread that, once you started pulling it, had a way of leading somewhere unexpected. Keep digging, he said. The shop settled into its usual Tuesday evening rhythm. The last few customers came and went. Amara turned the sign on the door to close at exactly 6 o'clock, the way she did every evening, and spent 40 minutes doing the things that needed doing at the end of the day. Wiping counters, checking inventory against tomorrow's order list, locking the cold cases, sweeping the old wooden floor that creaked in 3 specific places no matter how many times it had been repaired. The silver-haired woman, her name was Mrs. Eleanor Price, a retired schoolteacher who had been coming to the shop since it first opened, had stayed until nearly closing, the way she sometimes did on days when she wanted company more than groceries. She had bought her olive brine and a small wheel of aged cheese and 2 of the honey jars, and she had talked the way she always did, unhurried and warm, about her garden and her daughter and the book she was reading. She had not mentioned the 2 men who had stood at the counter that morning. But before she left, she had paused in the doorway and looked back at Amara with a look that said she had noticed more than she had commented on. "You be careful," she said quietly. "I always am," Amara said. Mrs. Price had nodded, pulled her coat closed against the cold, and disappeared into the evening. Now the shop was empty and quiet. The little lights around the door frame glowed against the darkened front window. The music had been turned off. Amara moved through the space alone, doing the last things, her footsteps familiar on the creaking floor. She stopped behind the counter. For a moment she stood very still, looking at the register, at the small wooden stool she sometimes sat on during slow afternoons, at the surface of the counter where Salvatore De Luca had placed both hands and leaned forward and looked at her with that expression she had expected and prepared herself for. Then she reached beneath the counter, not to the drawer where she kept the petty cash tin or the order forms or the spare apron, but further back to a space behind the lower shelf where an old wooden box sat in the dark. She had kept it there for years. It was not large, roughly the size of a shoebox, though narrower, with dovetail joints at the corners that someone had made by hand a long time ago. The wood had darkened with age. The small brass latch on the front had long since stopped functioning, so it was held shut with a length of narrow cloth ribbon tied in a knot. She untied the ribbon carefully. She opened the box. Inside was an old photograph. Not digital, a physical print, the kind made in the 80s or early 90s, slightly faded at the edges where the color had shifted toward yellow with time. It showed 2 people standing in front of what appeared to be a low stone building in bright sunlight. The background was arid, pale ground, a few dusty shrubs, a sky the washed-out blue of high heat. One of the people was a man. He was somewhere in his 40s, solidly built, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair going silver at the temples. He wore work clothes, not formal, not casual, but the practical kind of clothes that people wear when they spend their days outdoors doing something that matters. He was smiling, not a posed smile, a real one, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth. The other person in the photograph was a child. A girl, small for her apparent age of perhaps 6 or 7, with serious eyes and a slightly uncertain expression, as though she wasn't entirely sure how to pose for photographs, but was doing her best. The man's hand rested on the girl's shoulder, easy and protective. Amara looked at the photograph for a long moment. She looked at it the way you look at something you have looked at so many times that you have stopped seeing the image itself and started seeing only what it means. Then she closed the box carefully, retied the ribbon, and returned it to its place in the dark beneath the counter. She stood up. She turned off the last of the lights behind the counter and gathered her coat from the hook near the backroom door. Her phone buzzed on the counter as she was pulling her coat on. She picked it up and looked at the screen. One new message. Unknown number. She opened it. The message contained 4 words. You shouldn't have spoken. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down on the counter and stood in the dim quiet of the closed shop for a moment, the little lights around the door frame still glowing amber against the dark glass. Then she put the phone in her coat pocket, picked up her keys, and walked out into the cold October night. Salvatore De Luca was not a man who lost sleep easily. He had made decisions over the course of his career that would have kept other men staring at the ceiling for months. Acquisitions that gutted entire workforces, legal maneuvers that buried competitors quietly and completely, negotiations where the outcome for the losing party was something close to ruin. He had made those decisions in full awareness of what they were, and slept without difficulty afterward, because he understood that the world he operated and ran on a specific kind of logic, and he had never pretended otherwise. But the night after Amara Brooks answered him in the San Fratello dialect, he did not sleep. He lay in the dark of his apartment. 43rd floor, the whole city spread out below him like a circuit board, and listened to her voice in his memory. Not what she had said, the way she had said it, the particular flatness of the vowels, the way certain consonants softened at the end of words, a feature so specific to San Fratello that even neighboring villages in the same mountain range didn't share it. His grandmother had spoken that way. His great-uncles had spoken that way. He had spent his childhood summers absorbing those sounds without meaning to, the way children absorb everything, without effort, without intention, and therefore completely. What Amara had spoken was not an approximation. It was not the attempt of someone who had studied the language from recordings or learned it at a distance. It had come from inside her, natural and unhesitating, the way language only lives when it has been carried since childhood. By 3 a.m, he had made a decision. By 6 he had called his assistant. By noon he was on a flight to Palermo. The drive from Palermo up into the Nebrodi Mountains took 2 hours on roads that wound through landscape so unchanged that Salvatore sometimes felt, on these rare visits, as though the island existed outside of time. The villages here were small and old and built from the same pale stone as the hillsides they sat on, so that from a distance they looked less like human construction and more like something the mountain had grown itself. San Fratello sat high on a ridge, the streets narrow enough in places that 2 people couldn't walk side by side without turning slightly, the buildings leaning close overhead the way buildings do in places that were built before anyone thought about space. It was not a town that welcomed strangers warmly, not because the people were unfriendly, but because they had been the kind of community that turned inward for centuries and had never entirely stopped. Salvatore knew how to come here. He knew which streets to take and which faces to meet with a nod rather than a word. He had the blood, even if he had built his life far away from it, and blood counted for something here in ways it didn't count anywhere else. The priest was named Father Carmelo Vitali. He was somewhere past 80, slight and white-haired, with eyes that had the particular quality of very old eyes that had seen so much they had stopped being surprised by most things. He lived in a small house attached to the church of San Alfonso and received Salvatore in a sitting room crowded with books and old photographs, and the smell of coffee brewed strong enough to strip paint. Salvatore told him what had happened, carefully, leaving certain things out, framing it as a puzzle rather than an accusation. He described a woman who had spoken the dialect. He described the precision of it. He asked whether Father Carmelo had any memory of anyone leaving the community who might have passed the language on. The priest was quiet for a long time after Salvatore finished speaking. Then he said, "Tell me the precise construction she used. Not the words, the shape of the sentence." Salvatore repeated it as accurately as he could. The way the verb had come at the end. The way the conditional had been constructed. Father Carmelo set his coffee cup down. "That construction," he said slowly, "is specific to families from the upper quarter of the village. 3, perhaps 4 families used it that way." He paused. "Salvatore, do you remember Giovanni?" The name landed strangely. Giovanni De Luca had existed in the family's collective memory as a kind of cautionary absence, a man who had been there and then wasn't, a name that appeared occasionally in old conversations and was usually followed by a shift in subject. Salvatore had been young when Giovanni left. He remembered a tall man with a serious face who laughed rarely, but genuinely, who always brought something from the market when he visited, who had spoken to Salvatore once, memorably, about the difference between being feared and being respected. I remember him, Salvatore said carefully. He left under difficult circumstances, Father Carmelo said. He did not phrase it as a question. There were accusations, Salvatore said. Money that went missing from the family business. He was accused of taking it. The priest nodded slowly, looking at his hands. He came to see me before he left. He was not a man who showed distress easily. You will remember that about him, if you remember him at all. But that night he was frightened. Not for himself, for what he had found. He looked up. He told me he had discovered something about the family business that he could not ignore. He did not tell me specifically what it was, but he said that if he stayed and spoke, he would be silenced. And if he left, at least the truth might survive somewhere. Salvatore was very still. He said that. He asked me to pray for him. The priest's voice was even. I told him I would. I have every week since. Whether it did him any good, I cannot say. There was a silence between them. He was working overseas before he died, Salvatore said. Humanitarian work, the family was told. He went to Africa. He wrote to me twice, not letters exactly, more like notes. Brief. He said he was doing work that felt useful, and that he had found an unexpected purpose there. Father Carmelo paused. In his second note, he mentioned a child, an orphan girl he had taken in. He said she was bright and watchful, and that she had learned to speak his dialect because she had nothing else to hold on to when she arrived. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the narrow window, a pigeon moved on a stone ledge and then was gone. He said she spoke it as though she had been born to it. The priest continued. The way certain people pick up language, not as a tool, but as a home. He looked at Salvatore directly. After Giovanni died, I wrote twice to the address he had given me. I never received a response. I assumed the girl had been placed somewhere. Perhaps an institution. Perhaps a family. I did not know. He folded his hands. I have wondered about her since. Salvatore drove back down the mountain in the early evening, the light going amber and long over the slopes, the same way it had gone when he was 7 years old, and his father had driven him up this same road for a family gathering he was too young to fully understand. He thought about Giovanni, the precise angle of the man's seriousness, the laugh that arrived rarely but landed fully. He thought about a child who had learned a mountain dialect in a country far from a mountain because it was the only language she had that belonged to someone who loved her. He thought about a woman standing behind a counter in a quiet grocery shop, scanning a jar of preserved lemons, answering in a voice that had come from somewhere deeper than learning. He boarded the return flight to the city with the particular feeling of a man who had gone looking for one answer and come back carrying something much heavier than he had expected to find. While Salvatore was in Sicily, Luca was not idle. He had interpreted Salvatore's order to dig into Amara's background as permission to apply a broader kind of pressure, and he had spent the 4 days of Salvatore's absence deploying the particular toolkit that the De Luca organization had refined over years of acquiring properties and businesses whose owners needed convincing. First came a zoning inspector, a city employee who owed a favor and who arrived unannounced one Wednesday morning to conduct a thorough review of the shop's compliance with commercial zoning requirements. He spent 2 hours examining the premises and left with a clipboard full of notes, citing 3 minor issues that, he implied, could result in operational restrictions if not addressed within 60 days. 2 days later, a health and safety assessor appeared. He found a shelf bracket slightly out of specification and a ventilation gap in the storage room that fell 1 centimeter below the required minimum. Both were recorded formally. By the end of the week, a letter arrived from a corporate law firm informing Amara Brooks that the De Luca Development Group was initiating a formal review of the original property transfer documents on the grounds that the estate claim used to establish ownership 15 years prior may not have met the legal threshold required. Amara read each document carefully and filed them in a folder she kept beneath the counter beside the old wooden box. She did not close the shop. She did not reduce her hours. She did not appear, to anyone watching, to be particularly disturbed. The regular customers noticed the way regular customers always notice things. Mrs. Eleanor Price was in on the Thursday, when the health assessor showed up, and she watched the whole inspection with her arms folded and an expression that radiated controlled disapproval. A young man named Marcus Webb, who came in twice a week for coffee and a specific brand of smoked salt, asked Amara directly whether she needed anything. She thanked him and said she was fine. Word moved through the neighborhood the way word does in places where people have been paying attention to each other for a long time. By the following Monday, the shop was noticeably busier than usual. Detective Daniel Ruiz had been with the city for 11 years and had developed, over that time, a particular sensitivity to patterns. Not the dramatic patterns, not the obvious ones that announce themselves loudly. The quiet ones. The ones where a series of individually unremarkable events, lined up in sequence, started to look like something deliberate. He had noticed the zoning inspection because he happened to know the inspector personally and had seen him coming out of the shop on a Wednesday. He had noticed the legal letter because a source inside the city assessor's office had mentioned it in passing. And he had noticed, over the days that followed, that a small neighborhood grocery on Alderton and 4th had suddenly acquired 3 separate regulatory complications within the span of a single week. He drove past the shop on a Friday afternoon and sat in his car for a while, looking at it. Then he went inside, bought a jar of honey and a bag of cardamom, and spent 10 minutes having a perfectly normal conversation with the owner about nothing in particular. He came back the following Wednesday and did the same thing. He did not introduce himself as a detective. He was simply a man who had found a good shop and seemed to like the honey. Salvatore returned from Sicily on a Friday evening, and on Saturday morning there was an envelope on his desk that had been placed there by the building's overnight mail. No return address. His name written in careful block letters on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, written in pen, were several lines in the San Fratello dialect. He read them slowly, twice. The lines said, roughly translated, "The river doesn't forget where it started. Neither does the stone that was thrown into it. Someone drew blood from the water and called it clean. The fish that swam in it no different." It was cryptic in the way that old proverbs from the village tended to be cryptic, meaning layered under meaning, nothing stated plainly, because plain statement had always been considered a kind of vulnerability. But the implication was unmistakable. Something had been done. Something had been covered. And someone who knew the dialect, someone who knew the particular metaphorical grammar of San Fratello, was saying so. He told Luca about the letter. Luca's response was immediate and practical. It was Amara trying to unsettle him psychologically, and they should proceed with the legal approach without delay. Salvatore wasn't certain. The letter had arrived while he was still in Sicily, which meant either Amara had known he was there or someone else entirely was involved. Either possibility was troubling for different reasons. 2 more letters arrived over the following week, each one in the same careful pen, the same block lettering on the envelope, the same layered dialect on the page. The second letter referred to a ship carrying weight that had never been declared. The third contained only a single line. The man they called a thief was the only honest one among them. Salvatore read that last line at his desk on a Tuesday morning with the city laid out below him through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and he sat with it for a long time. He was not certain of anything yet, but the certainty he had carried into that grocery shop 2 weeks ago, the certainty that this was a straightforward acquisition problem, a stubborn owner who needed the right kind of pressure, a piece of land his company needed and would obtain, that certainty had developed cracks. He told Luca to pause the legal proceedings temporarily. Luca disagreed. Luca disagreed with some force, actually pointing out that they had a timeline, that the logistics project depended on that corner, that pausing now would be read as weakness by the acquisition team and would embolden the owner to hold out longer. He said all of this with the measured precision of a man making a business argument, which it was. Salvatore listened. Then he said he wanted to speak to Amara again himself, and that the legal approach could wait 1 more week. Luca said nothing to this, but his silence had a texture to it. He went back to the shop on a Thursday evening, arriving just before closing time, when the last customer, a young woman buying olive oil and a bundle of dried thyme, was on her way out the door. Amara looked up when he came in. If she was surprised to see him, she did not show it. She finished processing the young woman's purchase, said goodbye by name, and then turned to face Salvatore as the door closed behind the departing customer. "We're closing in 10 minutes, she said. "I know," he said. "I won't need long." She did not invite him behind the counter. He stood on the customer side, the way he had the first time, the honey jars and the dried herbs and the soft ambient light of the shop around them. It was different in the evening, quieter, the street outside gone dark, the little lights around the door frame doing more work now against the darkness. He placed the 3 letters on the counter. He had brought the originals, not copies. He smoothed them out carefully and pushed them toward her. Amara looked down at them. She read each one without picking them up, her expression calm and unreadable. Then she looked up at him. "You didn't write these," he said. It was not a question. He had looked at the handwriting against the sample he had from her shop license documents. It didn't match. "No," she said simply. "But you know what they mean." She held his gaze. "I know what they say." He pulled the letters back and folded them carefully. "I went to Sicily," he said. "I spoke to Father Carmelo Vitali." He remembered Giovanni. He remembered that Giovanni had taken in a child before he died. He paused. A girl, who learned the San Fratello dialect as a child. The shop was very quiet. From somewhere outside, distantly, the sound of a bus moving down the street, and then silence again. Amara stood behind the counter with her hands resting flat on its surface. She was looking at him with the same steadiness she had always looked at him with, but there was something beneath it now. Not emotion exactly, but the suggestion of something held very still that might be emotion if it were released. "I'm not going to pretend anymore that this is only about the property," Salvatore said. "I came in here 3 weeks ago planning to pressure you into selling. I thought you were being irrational or stubborn or hiding something I could use." He looked at the letters in his hand, then back at her. "I need to know who you are. I need to know how you know that dialect, and I need to know what connection you have to Giovanni De Luca. Because the alternative is that I walk out of here and let my cousin do what he's been doing. I don't think either of us wants that." The corporate pressure, the inspectors, the legal letters. He was naming all of it, acknowledging it, which was something Salvatore De Luca did not do in the ordinary course of business. He was doing it because he had sat with those letters for a week and driven down from the mountain in the Sicilian evening and lain awake 2 more nights. And he needed the shape of things to become clear. Amara was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached beneath the counter. She placed the wooden box on the surface between them. She untied the ribbon. She opened it slowly and laid the contents out one by one. The photograph, the man and the girl in the bright, arid sunlight. A small stack of letters, the paper yellowed and soft with age, written in the San Fratello dialect in handwriting that was immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever received correspondence from that particular part of the world. And a silver ring, small but heavy-looking, its surface engraved with an intricate pattern that Salvatore recognized before he fully understood that he recognized it, the way the mind sometimes processes meaning faster than the body can respond. The De Luca family crest. He had seen it on documents, on old pieces of jewelry, on a framed piece of silverwork that had hung in his grandmother's house. It was not common. It was not the kind of thing that appeared by coincidence. He looked at the ring for a long moment. Then he looked up at Amara. She met his eyes steadily, without drama, without performance. Just that careful steadiness that had been there from the beginning, that he now understood was not indifference, but something closer to endurance. The composure of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had learned to carry it without letting it show. "He raised me," she said quietly. "From the time I was 6 years old. He taught me the dialect because it was his language, and he wanted me to have something that was genuinely his to give." She looked at the photograph on the counter between them. "He taught me to cook the food of San Fratello. He taught me the names of the mountain plants. He told me the old stories of the village. He gave me everything he carried with him." She paused, and before he died, he told me that someday someone from his family might come looking, and that I should not run from them, but I should not trust them easily either. Salvatore's chest was tight in a way he did not know what to do with. He looked at the ring. He looked at the letters. He looked at the photograph of the man he remembered, the serious face, the rare, genuine laugh, the hand on the child's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it, though he wasn't entirely sure yet what he was sorry for. There were several candidates. "You came here to take us home," Amara said, not accusingly. Factually, the last place he protected, the last thing he held on to. She reached out and touched the edge of the photograph gently. "That's why I wouldn't sell. Not for any price. Because this isn't my shop. It's his." Salvatore was quiet. He could feel something reorganizing itself inside him. The architecture of the last 3 weeks, the shape of what he had believed and what he had assumed and what he had been wrong about, shifting into a new configuration that he was not yet ready to look at fully. He thought about the letters. The man they called a thief was the only honest one among them. He thought about what Father Carmelo had said, that Giovanni had told him he had found something he could not ignore, and that if he stayed and spoke, he would be silenced. "The letters," he said carefully, "the ones that were sent to me. You don't know who wrote them." "No," Amara said, "but someone wants you to keep asking questions." He looked at her directly. What was it that he found? What did Giovanni discover that was worth destroying him over? Amara held his gaze for a long moment, and then, with the same quiet composure she had carried through everything, she said, "Because the man your family erased raised me as his daughter." Salvatore stood completely still. The little lights around the door frame glowed in the dark outside the glass. The shop was silent around them. Somewhere deep in the building, the old wooden floor settled with a soft sound, the way old buildings do at the end of the day. He looked at the ring on the counter. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the woman standing across from him, calm, certain, carrying something that had been waiting years for this exact moment to be said aloud. And for the first time since he had walked into this shop 3 weeks ago thinking he was the most powerful person in the room, Salvatore De Luca understood that he had no idea how deep this went. The words settled into the quiet shop the way heavy things settle, slowly, with a finality that rearranges everything around them. Salvatore did not speak for a long time. He stood on the customer side of the counter with the wooden box open between them, looking at the ring and the photographs and the letters in their yellowed softness, and he felt something happening inside him that he could not have named precisely, but that had the quality of solid ground becoming uncertain underfoot. He had known men who lied well. He had built a career, in part, on the ability to identify them. The specific texture of fabrication, the slight over-precision of rehearsed stories, the way invented details cluster too neatly, the almost imperceptible delay before a constructed answer arrives. He had learned to read all of it across 30 years of negotiations and acquisitions and the particular kind of human chess that accompanied serious money. Amara was not lying. He knew it the way he knew certain things. Not through analysis, but through something older, a reading of the room that lived below the level of conscious thought. "You said he told you someone from the family might come," Salvatore said finally. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "How long have you been waiting?" "Since I was old enough to understand what waiting meant," Amara said. She did not say it with self-pity. She said it the way you state a fact about weather. He looked at the ring again. He had seen it once before in his life, in a photograph his grandmother kept, a formal portrait of the De Luca men taken at some gathering before Salvatore was born. Giovanni had been wearing it in that photograph. His grandmother had pointed him out. That one, the serious one, he was always the most serious of all of them, and Salvatore had looked at it once and not thought about it again for decades. "I need you to tell me everything," he said. Amara considered him for a moment. Then she reached beneath the counter and produced 2 small ceramic cups and a stovetop espresso pot that was apparently kept back there for purposes exactly like this one. Long conversations at the end of long days. She filled both cups without asking whether he wanted any and pushed one across the counter toward him. He accepted it. He was not sure why, except that it seemed like the right response. "He found me in a village outside Kampala," Amara said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "I was 6. Both my parents had died from illness within a few months of each other. There was no family left in a position to take me in. Giovanni was working with a humanitarian logistics program. He had set it up himself, actually using company resources because he believed the shipping infrastructure the family had built could do more than move cargo for profit." Salvatore listened. He was not supposed to stay more than a year, she continued. But he stayed 4. And somewhere in the second year, he decided that leaving me behind was not something he could do. She paused. He was not a sentimental man, for what I understand of him now, but he was a principled one. And his principle in that moment was that a child without anyone should not remain without anyone if there is someone who could help it. He brought you back to the work site, Salvatore said slowly. He raised you there. He raised me wherever the work took him. We moved twice in 4 years. He taught me his language deliberately. He said language was the most honest gift one person could give another because you cannot fake having it. She looked at the photograph on the counter. He told me stories about San Fratello the way other people tell children fairy tales. The mountain, the church, the way the light came through the valley in the early morning. She was quiet for a moment. I've never been there, but I know it as well as anywhere I have actually lived. Salvatore set his cup down carefully. When did he die? I was 10. She said it without flinching, the way you speak about old wounds that have long since closed, even if they haven't disappeared. It was presented as an accident, a fall during an inspection of a warehouse facility. The report was brief, and the conclusion was quick, and the company representative who arrived afterward was more interested in the equipment inventory than in finding out exactly what had happened. Which company was the representative from? Amara met his eyes. Take one guess. The tightness in his chest again. He looked at the ring. After he died, he said. After he died, I was placed with a local family for 2 years. Then I made my way here. I was 12. I did what 12-year-olds do when they have no one. I found people who were kind and I stayed close to them, and I grew up faster than anyone should have to. She said it without asking for anything. I found this building when I was 17. The man who owned it then was old and alone and had more in common with people who have been forgotten than with people who are remembered. He let me work for him. When he died, he left a note saying the building should go to the girl who kept it running because the lawyers could fight over the rest. And the estate claim, Salvatore said, was legitimate, she said calmly, and was challenged 3 times by people who had no actual interest in the property, but a great deal of interest in making things difficult for me. I won all 3 challenges. The documents are filed. She looked at him steadily. Your lawyers know this, Mr. DeLuca. The challenge your company filed last week is the 4th. You will not win it either. He was quiet. Giovanni told me about the letters. Amara continued, and her voice shifted slightly, not in tone, but in the particular care with which she chose each word. Before he died, he sat me down the way he sometimes did when he had something important to say, and he told me that he had discovered something about the family business that he could not stay silent about, and that powerful people in the family had decided that his silence was worth more than his life. She paused. He told me that he had hidden proof, and he told me where. Salvatore looked up. He told me that if anyone from the DeLuca family ever found me, Amara said, I would need to decide whether that person was someone Giovanni would have trusted. He said I would know, because he said the family had produced exactly 2 kinds of people in his experience. Those who understood what the name should mean, and those who had confused it with what it was worth. And which kind am I? Salvatore said. Amara looked at him for a long moment with those steady, measuring eyes. I haven't decided yet, she said, but you're still here, which is more than I expected. She picked up the silver ring from the counter and held it out to him. He looked at it sitting in her open palm. The weight of it, the engraving worn smooth in places from decades of being worn and handled and carried. He reached out and took it slowly, feeling the warmth it had picked up from her hand. He said if the right person ever came, Amara said quietly, I should show them what he left behind. She moved around the counter toward the back of the shop. The floor was old. Salvatore had noticed it without thinking about it on his first visit. The wide planks, darkened with age, creaking softly in 3 or 4 specific places with the particular voice of wood that has been walked on by the same feet for many years. He had registered it the way you register background details without assigning them meaning. Amara crossed to a specific section near the far wall, between a set of shelving units that held ceramic storage jars and a low wooden table where produce was sometimes displayed. She crouched down and pressed the edge of one of the floor planks with her palm in a precise location. The plank lifted along a concealed hinge. Not dramatically, not like something from a film, but with the ordinary practicality of a thing that had been built carefully by someone who knew what they were doing. Beneath the plank was a narrow space, perhaps 2 feet deep. Inside it was a metal case, roughly the size of a large briefcase, dark with age and surface oxidation, secured with a simple padlock. Amara produced a small key from a chain she wore around her neck beneath her shirt. She unlocked the case and lifted the lid. Inside, arranged with the particular order of someone who knew that the contents had to survive and be understood, a stack of ledgers, their covers worn but their pages intact, a bundle of shipping manifests tied with faded cord, and a collection of letters in their original envelopes, each one dated in Giovanni's handwriting. Salvatore crouched beside her and looked at the documents without touching them. The ledgers were shipping records, columns of cargo entries, dates, routes, amounts. Even at a glance, even in the dim light of the shop at this hour, the irregularities were visible. Entries that appeared twice under different names. Routes that didn't correspond to any legitimate trading port he recognized from that period. Cargo descriptions that were clearly euphemistic, the kind of language people used when they needed a manifest to pass inspection, but didn't want the manifest to say what the cargo actually was. His father had taught him to read a shipping ledger when he was 9 years old. He had spent his entire professional life in this industry. He knew exactly what he was looking at. "How long have you been keeping these here?" he said. "Since I was 17, Amara said. "Since I found this building and understood why Giovanni had owned it briefly years before. He used it as a storage point. He knew the owner. It was one of several places he moved things through, legal things then." She looked at the documents. "He put this here because he knew that the DeLuca organization would never think to look for evidence against itself in a building connected to its own history. He said the best hiding places were always in plain sight of the people who were looking." Salvatore reached out and carefully opened the top ledger to a marked page. The entries were from a period approximately 32 years ago. He recognized the shipping route designations, the internal coding system the DeLuca company had used in that era before the digital transition. He had learned those codes as a young man entering the business. He recognized 2 sets of initials in the authorization column. He did not say them aloud, but he recognized them. His jaw tightened. He closed the ledger carefully and set it back exactly as it had been. "The letters," he said. He nodded toward the bundled correspondence. "From Giovanni to people he trusted," Amara said, documenting what he found, documenting that he intended to take it to the authorities, and documenting his belief that he would be prevented from doing so. She paused. "The last letter is addressed to his family. He wrote it 2 days before he died. He never sent it." Salvatore was quiet for a long moment, crouched beside the open case in the evening stillness of the shop. Then he stood up slowly and looked at Amara. "I need time," he said. "You have had 30 years," she said, not unkindly. "Simply, I need a few days," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I knew any of this. But I need to look at what I have access to in the company archives and understand the full shape of it before I can know what to do with it." He looked at the case. "Keep this safe." "I always have," she said. He did not sleep that night either. But this time the sleeplessness had a different quality. Not the circular confusion of a puzzle he couldn't resolve, but the sharp, grinding discomfort of a man beginning to understand that the floor beneath everything he had built his life on might have been laid over something rotten. He sat at his desk in the dark apartment and thought about the initials in the ledger. He was not ready to name them yet, even in his own mind. The naming of them would make the thing real in a way that could not be walked back. And Salvatore DeLuca had not survived in his world by rushing toward irreversible conclusions. He was a man who gathered information until the weight of it became impossible to argue with, and then he acted decisively. He needed more. He also needed, he realized, to be careful about how he moved in the next several days. Because Luca would be watching. Luca had been with the DeLuca organization since he was 23 years old. He was smart, loyal in the transactional sense that most people in corporate power structures understood loyalty, and ruthlessly practical about the difference between what was true and what was useful. He had always operated in the space where those 2 things overlapped, and when they didn't overlap, he had a well-developed instinct for which one to prioritize. Salvatore had never had reason to question that instinct before. He was questioning it now. He went back to the shop 2 nights later, arriving after closing, rapping quietly on the glass. Amara let him in without comment, as though she had expected him. She locked the door behind them, and they sat at the small table she kept in the back room, where she took her breaks, where she kept a kettle and a few mugs and a stack of food industry catalogs, and Salvatore laid out what he needed. "I want to look at the manifests again," he said, "specifically the routing codes from that period. I need to cross-reference them against what I can access in the company archives." Amara retrieved the case from beneath the floor. She sat on the table between them and opened it, and they worked through the shipping manifest together for the better part of 2 hours, Salvatore going slowly through each document while Amara sat across from him, answering his questions when he had them and saying nothing when he didn't. What emerged from the documents, assembled with the patience of people working through something they needed to be certain of, was a structure. Not a simple theft, not an opportunistic diversion of funds. Something built deliberately and maintained over years. Cargo moved through DeLuca routes under false designations. The profits channeled through a series of offshore arrangements that had been disguised within the company's legitimate international expansion during that period. It had been constructed by people who understood the shipping business completely and understood the company's internal oversight mechanisms well enough to work around them without triggering attention. It had been constructed by people on the inside. High up on the inside. "The 2 sets of initials in the primary ledger," Salvatore said. He kept his voice level. "One of them I recognized as a senior logistics director from that period. A man named Farrow. He retired in good standing 15 years ago. And the other?" Amara said. Salvatore was quiet. "Salvatore," she said, gently but directly. "My father's brother," he said. "My uncle. He died 8 years ago." He looked at the table. He was considered one of the architects of the company's expansion in that era. There are 2 conference rooms at the main office named after him. Amara said nothing. She allowed the silence to hold the weight of it without rushing past it. "Giovanni found this," Salvatore said. He was talking through it as much as to her. "He found it, and he documented it, and he brought it to someone in the family, or tried to, and instead of being listened to, he was accused of the very theft he was trying to report. He exhaled slowly, and then he died in a warehouse accident that no one investigated properly." "Yes," Amara said simply. "And my father." He stopped. He tried again. "My father rebuilt the company after the scandal of Giovanni's supposed theft. He used the disgrace of Giovanni as the reason the company needed restructuring. He presented himself as the man who cleaned it up." He looked at the documents on the table. Whether he knew the truth of it. "You don't know yet," Amara said. "No," he said. "I don't know yet." They sat with that for a moment. "These documents can't stay here," he said finally. "Now that I know about them, now that I've been here twice after hours, it's only a matter of time before Luca figures out what I've been doing." He looked at her directly. "Luca is practical above everything else. If he believes these documents are a threat to the organization, he will not wait for me to decide what to do about them." Amara looked at him with that measuring quality she had. "You think he'd move against the shop?" "I think he would do whatever he calculated was necessary," Salvatore said carefully. "And I think you should assume that your safety margin is shorter than it was a week ago." She nodded once. "I'll move them." "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," she agreed. Luca had a source inside Salvatore's building security. Not a spy, exactly, more a facility contact who noticed things and mentioned them in exchange for considerations that never appeared on any official record. Through this contact, Luca learned within 48 hours that Salvatore had visited the shop on Alderton Street twice after closing hours, staying each time for more than an hour. Luca sat with this information for one day. He turned it over, examined it from different angles, considered its implications. Then he made a call. He did not tell Salvatore. He told himself this was because there was nothing to tell yet. He was simply taking a precautionary step, arranging for someone to take a look at the shop and determine what was being kept there. He told himself that if Salvatore had been compromised by whatever manipulation the shopkeeper was running, then protecting the organization was more important than protocol. He told himself these things in the clean, rational language of a man who has learned to give his worst instincts the most reasonable-sounding explanations. 3 nights after Salvatore's second visit, just after 2 in the morning, the front window of Brooks' specialty grocery was broken. Amara got the call at 2:17 a.m. from the automated alarm system. She arrived at the shop 11 minutes later to find the front window shattered, glass spread across the sidewalk and across the interior floor, the shelves nearest the entrance overturned, jars broken, products scattered. The back room had been searched, thoroughly, not destructively, which was actually more telling than destruction would have been. Destruction was rage or cover. Careful searching was purpose. The floor near the far wall had been examined. The shelving units had been moved. The plank had been lifted. The space beneath it was empty. Amara stood in the middle of her ransacked shop in the middle of the night and looked at the empty hiding space for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and called the police. Detective Daniel Ruiz caught the case because he was on overnight rotation and because dispatch flagged the address. He recognized the address immediately. He arrived to find Amara standing in the middle of her shop, calm in the particular way that people are calm when they have made a deliberate decision to be, surrounded by the evidence of someone having gone through the place with clear professional purpose. He noted the window. He noted the back room. He noted the disturbed floor panel near the far wall, the hinge plank, its concealment mechanism now visible in a way that suggested whoever had lifted it had not bothered to close it again afterward. He asked Amara the standard questions. She answered them accurately and without volunteering anything extra, which was also something he noted, not as evasion, but as the behavior of someone who had already decided how much of this story they were ready to tell to a stranger with a badge. He walked through the shop slowly, looking at things. He noted the quality of the disruption. The back room searched systematically, drawers opened and closed rather than emptied on the floor. The shelving units in the main space moved along a path that suggested a specific objective rather than general destruction. Anything kept under that panel, he said, looking at the open hinge. Not anymore, Amara said. He looked at her. She held his gaze without difficulty. Is there something specific I should know about? He said carefully. There may be, she said. But I'd like to know a little more about you before I decide how much to share. He almost smiled at that. Fair enough, he said. He left her his card, told her someone would be out in the morning to take a formal report, and walked back to his car. He sat there for a few minutes before starting the engine, looking at the broken window and the soft amber lights still glowing inside. 3 regulatory actions against this shop in 1 week. A break-in with professional characteristics. A specific search of a concealed compartment. He thought about the name at the top of the corporate letterhead on those regulatory notices. He took out his notebook and wrote down 2 things, DeLuca Development and a question mark. Then he started the car and drove back into the city night. Salvatore found out about the break-in the next morning. Not from Luca, who said nothing about it, but from a brief news item flagged by his assistant in the daily summary. A break-in at a small specialty grocery on Alderton Street. No injuries. Police investigating. He read it twice. Then he called Luca. I saw it, Lucas said before Salvatore could speak. His tone was even. Informational. Did you arrange it? Salvatore said. A pause. Not a long one. I arranged a look, Lucas said. The shop contains something you've been visiting twice a week after hours without explaining to anyone. The organization has a right to know what you've been shown. The organization, Salvatore said, is me. The organization is 30 years of work by your father and his brother and every person who... Did you find anything? Salvatore said. Another pause. Longer this time. No, Lucas said. Whatever was there wasn't there. Salvatore said nothing. Salvatore, Lucas said, and his voice dropped slightly, becoming something closer to genuine. Whatever that woman has shown you, whatever story she's told, you need to consider the possibility that she is using it, that it is a construction designed specifically to make you doubt the things that need to not be doubted. He paused. Digging into the past doesn't produce justice. It produces chaos, and chaos destroys things that took decades to build. And if what was built deserves to be destroyed, Salvatore said. Silence. Then God help all of us, Lucas said quietly. because there won't be anything left worth saving. He ended the call. Salvatore set the phone down on his desk and looked out at the city. 30 floors below, the streets moved with their ordinary morning traffic. Taxis and delivery vans, and people walking fast with their coffee cups. The whole enormous, indifferent machinery of a city going about its business without any awareness of what was happening in this office, in this quiet, in the mind of a man who was beginning to understand that the most important question of his life was not whether the truth could be found, but whether he had the courage to do something with it once. It was. He picked up the phone again. He called Amara. She answered on the second ring. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "The documents?" "Safe," she said. "I moved them the same night." "Good." He looked at his desk, at the company archives he had begun pulling over the past 2 days, the folders and the old digitized records and the shipping logs from the era the ledgers described. "I've been going through the company records," he said. "I need more time. But what I've found so far," he stopped. "It matches." A silence on the line. Not uncomfortable. The silence of two people standing at the edge of something large. "What happens next?" Amara said. "I don't know yet," Salvatore said honestly. "But I think we need to stop being on opposite sides of this." Another silence. Briefer. "I think so too," Amara said quietly. The company archives occupied 3 floors of a climate-controlled storage facility in the eastern part of the city, the kind of place that existed in the background of large organizations. Unremarkable from the outside, full of the accumulated paperwork of decisions made by people who are now retired or dead or both. Salvatore had been there twice in his professional life, both times for legal proceedings that required pulling old documents. He had never gone there to look for something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. He went alone. He told his assistant he was taking 2 personal days. He did not tell Luca where he was going. He had a list, assembled from the shipping manifests in Giovanni's hidden case, of specific routing codes, date ranges, and cargo designations. He worked through the archived records methodically, starting from the oldest files and moving forward, cross-referencing the internal coding system against what the documents described. It took most of the first day to locate the relevant records. It took most of the second day to understand what he was looking at fully. The operation had been running for 7 years. 7 years of falsified shipping manifests, cargo routed through legitimate DeLuca channels but carrying undeclared goods, industrial equipment components that weren't components, pharmaceutical supplies that weren't pharmaceuticals, the paperwork always just clean enough to pass at the ports they used, the discrepancies buried deeply enough in the volume of legitimate trade that a casual audit would never catch them. The offshore accounts that received the proceeds had been structured as investment vehicles, the kind of financial architecture that required someone who understood both international shipping and corporate finance at a very high level. His uncle Robert had understood both. Robert DeLuca had been, in the family's public narrative, the brilliant strategist who had identified the international expansion opportunities that doubled the company's reach in the 80s. He had died 8 years ago to considerable mourning and a long obituary in the business press that described his vision and his integrity and his lifelong devotion to the family enterprise. The initials in the ledger were his, confirmed beyond any reasonable argument by 3 separate cross-references Salvatore found in the archived records, internal memos in his uncle's handwriting, authorization signatures on the falsified manifests, and a single operational summary document that had apparently been misfiled in a legitimate acquisitions folder 30 years ago and simply never found because no one had ever looked. The second set of initials belonged to a man named Farrow. Gerald Farrow, Senior Logistics Director, retired 15 years ago with a generous package and a plaque. He was 72 years old now and lived in a house outside the city with a garden and 2 grandchildren who visited on weekends. And then there was the third thing Salvatore found on the afternoon of the second day in a folder of internal correspondence from the period immediately following Giovanni's death. A letter from his father, not to the authorities, not to Giovanni, to Robert. It was brief, and it was careful in the way that letters are careful when the writer knows that what they're saying should not be written down, but feels they have no other way to say it permanently enough. His father had written that he understood the necessity of what had been done regarding the Giovanni situation, that he trusted Robert's judgment on the matter, and that he expected the books to be fully corrected within the fiscal year so that the company could move forward cleanly. The Giovanni situation. His cousin's life and death and disgrace, reduced to a phrase in a business letter. Salvatore sat in the archive room with that letter in front of him and did not move for a long time. He had loved his father. He still did. In the complicated way you love someone who shaped everything about you and who turned out to have been something other than what you believed. His father had been dead for 6 years, which meant there was no conversation to be had, no confrontation to be managed, no chance for explanation or apology or the kind of reckoning that produces anything useful in the present tense. There was only this, a piece of paper in a climate-controlled room, and the understanding that the company Salvatore had spent his adult life running had been handed to him already stained. He photographed every relevant document with his phone. He locked the archive room behind him when he left. He sat in his car outside the facility for 20 minutes before he was ready to drive. Then he called Amara. She met him at the shop after closing. He spread the photographs across the counter the way she had once spread the contents of the wooden box. Everything laid out, nothing withheld. She looked through them carefully and quietly, and when she was finished, she set the last photograph down and was still for a moment. "Your father knew," she said. "He knew after the fact," Salvatore said. "Whether he knew beforehand, whether he gave any authorization for what happened to Giovanni, I can't confirm for what I found. But he knew, and he chose the company over the truth. He looked at the counter. He let Giovanni carry the disgrace. He let it stand." Amara said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was measured. "Giovanni told me your father had been kind to him once, when they were young. He said he had never understood how a man who was capable of genuine kindness could become capable of the other thing." She paused. "I think he never stopped hoping your father would correct it." "He didn't," Salvatore said. "No," she said. "He didn't." They stood on either side of the counter with the evidence spread between them, and the shop settled around them in the way it always did at this hour. The little lights glowing, the old floor quiet, the shelves of imported goods casting their patient presence over everything. "I'm going to take this public," Salvatore said. "All of it. The documents, the archives, everything." He looked at her directly. "I need to know you're prepared for what that means for both of us. It will be loud, and it will be ugly, and it will be a very long time before things are quiet again." "I've been waiting most of my life for it to stop being quiet," Amara said. Quiet was Giovanni dying in a warehouse with no one asking the right questions. Quiet was 30 years of a false story standing unchallenged. She met his eyes. "I'm not afraid of loud." He nodded slowly. "There's one more problem." Luca had found the loophole 6 weeks earlier, but had been holding it in reserve, the way a careful player holds a strong card, waiting for the moment when it would achieve maximum effect. The loophole existed in the original property transfer documents from 15 years ago, a technical deficiency in the estate claim process that a sufficiently determined corporate legal team could exploit to challenge the validity of Amara's ownership. It would not necessarily succeed in court, but it would be enough to trigger an injunction, freeze the property, and prevent any development or structural changes while litigation proceeded. Litigation that, with the DeLuca organization's legal resources, could be sustained for 2 or 3 years minimum. Luca filed the challenge on a Monday morning. The same morning Salvatore was meeting with a communications consultant to plan the press conference. The injunction application landed on Amara's phone as a legal notification at 9:14 a.m. She forwarded it to Salvatore without comment. He read it. He called Luca. "You filed it," he said. "The organization has an interest in that property that predates your current arrangement with the shopkeeper," Lucas said. His voice was composed and professional. "I'm protecting that interest." "You're protecting a secret that should have been exposed 30 years ago," Salvatore said. "I'm protecting 30 years of work," Lucas said, and for the first time there was something underneath the composure. Not anger exactly, but the pressure of something held very tightly. "I'm protecting the people who work for this company. I'm protecting the name. I'm protecting everything your father built, which is the same thing you have been the beneficiary of for your entire adult life." A pause. You don't get to carry the weight of something you didn't do, Salvatore. You inherited a company. You didn't commit a crime. No, Salvatore said. I just perpetuated one by not looking. Silence. I'm withdrawing the injunction, Salvatore said. This afternoon. And I'm asking you to step back from the organization while this process plays out. The silence was longer this time. If you do this, Lucas said quietly, there is no version of it that doesn't take everything apart. I know, Salvatore said. Luca ended the call. Detective Daniel Ruiz had been building his file quietly for 3 weeks. He had the break-in report. He had the pattern of regulatory actions against the shop, all 3 of which, when examined, traced back to contacts with documented relationships to the DeLuca organization. He had a conversation with a retired city inspector who remembered feeling uncomfortable about a particular inspection request he had been asked to conduct as a favor. He had, carefully and within the boundaries of what his position permitted, begun assembling a picture of coordinated corporate intimidation directed at a small business owner. He did not yet have the larger story, the smuggling operation, the decades-old conspiracy, the death of a man in a warehouse overseas. He had a mid-level investigation into commercial harassment and a break-in. But he was good at recognizing when a thread was part of a larger fabric, and the thread he was holding was very clearly part of something much larger. When Salvatore DeLuca's legal team reached out to his department, officially and on the record, to inform them that the DeLuca organization would be providing full cooperation with any investigation and that the company's CEO intended to make a public statement of significant scope, Detective Ruiz read the notification twice, and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called the number Amara Brooks had given him on the night of the break-in, when he had handed her his card, and she had said she might have more to tell him once she knew a little more about him. She answered on the second ring. I think I'm ready to tell you more, she said before he could speak. The press conference was held on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Salvatore's decision became final and irrevocable in his own mind. The venue was the DeLuca organization's main conference center, chosen deliberately because Salvatore wanted it to be clear that this was not a statement made from a distance. He was standing inside the thing he was exposing. He was not throwing a stone from the outside. He was opening the door himself. The room filled faster than his communications team had anticipated. What had been announced publicly as a major corporate statement from the CEO of one of the country's largest private shipping companies drew the kind of attention that large corporate statements sometimes drew. Business reporters, financial press, a few television cameras positioned along the back wall. What the advance notice had not specified was the nature of the statement, which had been held tightly enough that speculation was running in several different directions by the time the room was full. Mrs. Eleanor Price was sitting in the third row. She had been called by Amara the night before, told briefly what was going to happen, and asked if she would come. She had said yes immediately and arrived 20 minutes early, sitting with her hands folded on her canvas bag with the composed attentiveness of a woman who had spent decades as a schoolteacher and knew how to be present for important moments. Amara was not on the stage. She had chosen this deliberately, and Salvatore had respected it without argument. Giovanni's story deserved to be told correctly, and she had decided that the correct telling required Salvatore to stand in front of his own company in his own name and say the words himself. She sat in the back of the room, in a seat along the wall, and watched. Salvatore walked to the podium without notes. He had written notes. He had discarded them at 6 that morning, standing in his kitchen with a cup of coffee, because he had decided that reading from prepared text was a way of managing the discomfort of the thing, and he did not deserve to have his discomfort managed. He looked out at the room. My family built this company over several generations, he said. I was raised to believe that it was built on quality, on precision, and on a standard of conduct that distinguished the DeLuca name from competitors who were willing to cut corners or compromise their integrity for short-term gain. He paused. That story was partly true. And it was partly a lie that powerful members of my family told themselves and everyone around them in order to protect what they had done. The room was very still. He spoke for 37 minutes. He presented the documents, the ledgers, the shipping manifests, the archived records, the letter his father had written. He had worked with a legal team over the preceding 10 days to ensure that everything presented was verified, sourced, and defensible, because he understood that the only version of this that achieved anything lasting was one that could not be dismissed or dismantled by people with an interest in dismissing it. He named the operation. He described its scope and its duration. He named Gerald Farrow. He named his Uncle Robert. And he did it without flinching, though the sound of the name in that room in that context cost him something he would carry for a long time afterward. And then he spoke about Giovanni. He spoke about a man who had built something valuable in the family business, who had discovered that something corrupt was running underneath it, and who had tried to do the right thing in circumstances where the right thing was made deliberately impossible. He described Giovanni's work overseas, the humanitarian logistics program, the real work of a man who understood that ships could carry more than cargo. He spoke briefly and carefully about a child Giovanni had raised and what that said about the kind of man he had been. He said, "My cousin Giovanni DeLuca was not a thief. He was the most honest person in this organization at the time he was in it. He was falsely accused by people who needed him discredited, and he died without ever having his name cleared." That ends today. In the third row, Mrs. Eleanor Price unfolded her hands and placed one of them flat on the empty seat beside her, the way you reach for something that isn't there anymore but should be. In the back of the room, Amara sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes steady and dry. Not because the moment didn't reach her, but because she had been carrying it for so long that when it finally arrived it felt less like a wave and more like the tide going out, revealing what had always been underneath. The fallout was significant and immediate, and in the way of these things, somewhat chaotic in the weeks that followed. Gerald Farrow retained a lawyer within 24 hours of the press conference. 3 retired executives whose tenures overlapped with the period in question received formal inquiries from regulatory investigators within the week. The offshore accounts Salvatore's legal team had identified were flagged for examination by financial authorities. None of it moved quickly. These things never did. But it moved, which was the important part. The business press coverage was extensive and largely serious, because the documentation was extensive and serious. There was skepticism in some quarters. There always was when a powerful person announced something that damaged their own interests. But the skepticism could not find a foothold in the evidence, which had been assembled with the patience of a man and a woman who had between them decades of reasons to make sure it was right. Luca did not make a public statement. He stepped back from the organization quietly. His departure managed in the formal language that organizations use when someone leaves under circumstances that are not going to be discussed in detail. Salvatore had given him a choice, and Luca had chosen the exit over the exposure. Whether that was the right outcome, in some larger moral accounting, was a question Salvatore could not answer cleanly. He knew only that what Luca had done to the shop, the break-in, the harassment, the accumulated pressure, had been done in service of protecting something that had never deserved protection, and that the world Luca had helped maintain was no longer the world Salvatore was willing to run. Detective Ruiz's investigation, which had begun with a broken shop window and a methodically searched back room, was folded into a larger proceeding within 30 days. He continued to work it from his end, providing the local law enforcement dimension that the larger investigation needed. He stopped by the shop one afternoon, bought a jar of honey and a small bag of the cardamom he had gotten into the habit of using, and told Amara simply that he was glad she had kept the evidence safe. She thanked him and told him she had had good reasons to be careful. He told her he figured as much and left. The property question was resolved through a process that Salvatore's legal team initiated and that the courts ultimately confirmed within 4 months of the press conference. The building on the corner of Alderton Street and 4th had been briefly owned, 31 years ago, by a logistics subsidiary connected to Giovanni DeLuca's overseas work, a company that had been folded into the DeLuca organization after Giovanni's death and whose assets had been absorbed without proper estate proceedings. Giovanni had no documented heirs, but he had a daughter, raised as his own, whose connection to his estate could be established through the documents in the metal case, through the letters he had written, the records of her care, the ring, and the testimony of Father Carmelo Vitali, who provided a formal written statement from San Fratello confirming what Giovanni had told him about the child he had raised. The court recognized Amara Brooks as the rightful heir to Giovanni DeLuca's estate. The building was hers, had always been hers in the sense that matters, and was now hers in the sense that courts and deeds and official records make permanent. Salvatore announced, the same week the ruling came through, that the DeLuca organization was permanently withdrawing all acquisition interest in the property and the surrounding parcels. The logistics expansion project was redesigned around the site rather than through it, a costly adjustment that his engineering team managed without enthusiasm, but managed nonetheless. He also announced, in the same statement, the establishment of a reparations fund directed at communities affected by the illegal operations his family had run, a number arrived at through consultation with financial forensics experts and set at a figure that his board received with considerable unhappiness, and that he finalized anyway. The restructuring of the company's governance, new oversight mechanisms, independent directors, a complete audit of historical operations, took the better part of a year and occupied a significant portion of Salvatore's attention for most of it. It was not glamorous work. It was the work of a man cleaning something that had been allowed to become very dirty and doing it properly rather than quickly. The shop reopened 2 weeks after the press conference, having been closed during the period of the formal proceedings. When Amara turned the sign from closed to open on the first morning back, there was a small group of people waiting on the sidewalk outside. Some of them regular customers, some of them neighbors who had been following the story, some of them people she had never seen before who had read about the shop and felt, for whatever personal reason, that this was a place worth showing up for. Mrs. Eleanor Price was at the front of the group with her canvas bag and a look of settled satisfaction. The changes to the shop came gradually, which was the right way for them to come. The grocery remained exactly what it had always been. The shelves of imported goods, the spices in their paper bags, the honey jars, the aged cheese in the glass case, the soft music, the smell of cardamom and dried oranges, and the sweetness underneath everything. That did not change because it had never needed to change. What was added occupied the back section of the shop, where the old storeroom had been. A small reading area with a low shelf of books, Sicilian history, African literature, immigrant narratives, food writing from both traditions. A framed collection of photographs along one wall, including an enlarged reproduction of the photograph from the wooden box. Giovanni and the girl, standing in the bright, arid sunlight, his hand on her shoulder. Beside it, a small printed card explaining who he was and what he had done and what it had cost him and what it had ultimately meant. Above the photographs, in careful lettering that Amara painted herself over the course of a quiet Sunday afternoon, were words in both English and the San Fratello dialect. The English read, "Some truths take a long time to arrive. They're no less true for the wait." Salvatore came back to the shop on a Thursday morning in early spring, several months after the press conference. He came without his suit jacket, in just a shirt and coat against the last of the winter cold. He came without Luca, without an assistant, without the purposeful stride of a man conducting business. He came the way a person comes to a place they have been thinking about returning to for a while. The shop was quiet at that hour. A young woman was examining the olive oils near the window. The postal worker, the same one from that first morning, though Salvatore only half recognized him, was waiting at the counter with a small bag of figs already in his hand. Amara looked up when Salvatore came through the door. She finished with the postal worker, said goodbye by name, and then looked at Salvatore across the counter with that steadiness he had come to understand was not distance, but something more like depth, a quality that had been developed over many years of holding difficult things without being broken by them. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back," she said. In English, but only for a moment. Because then she said, in the dialect, in the flattened vowels and the softened consonants of a mountain village neither of them had grown up in, but that lived in both of them now for completely different reasons. Something that translated roughly as, "The door was always open." He stood at the counter and felt the words land the way they were meant to land. Not as a challenge this time, not as a revelation or a weapon or a proof of something, just as a greeting between two people who had come to understand each other across a long and difficult distance. He answered in the same dialect, with the careful pronunciation of a man who had grown up hearing it spoken, but was using it now with more intention than he ever had before. He said, "Then I should have come sooner." Amara smiled at that, a real one the kind that starts in the eyes. She reached under the counter and produced the small ceramic cups and the stovetop espresso pot, the same way she had on the night he had stood in this shop and begun to understand that the world was shaped differently than he had believed. She filled both cups. She pushed one across the counter toward him. He accepted it. He sat down on the small stool she kept on the customer side for people who wanted to stay a while. Outside, through the glass of the freshly replaced front window, the morning moved through its ordinary business. A bus, a woman with a stroller, two men carrying a ladder between them, the whole indifferent and beautiful machinery of a city going about its life. The little lights around the door frame glowed their amber warmth against the glass, the same as they always had, as though they had simply been waiting for the story to settle into something that deserved to be lit. They drank their coffee. They talked for a long time in a language that had once been used to trap and had become, in the end, the only language that told the truth. If the truth had stayed buried, would justice ever really be justice? Or just a story we tell ourselves to sleep at night? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more stories that remind you that the quietest people in the room are sometimes carrying the loudest truths.